In this short bonus video, you'll be shown an alternative method to setting the material value variable and checking for tags to make your code a little more efficient. In the script called f_player, we used if, else if, and else statements to check for specific conditions one at a time, which we used to then tell our script to change the value of the material value variable. However, the alternative method to using multiple else if statements like this is to use something called a switch statement. So in my script, I'm going to remove my if, else if, and else statements that control the setting of the material value variable. Now let's take a look at the difference between an if statement and a switch statement. Now with an if statement, we can only check for one condition at a time. We can combine them with else if and else statements whenever we want to check for multiple conditions if the first, in the original if statement, isn't met. However, with enough conditions, this can not only create messy looking code, but can be a little inefficient for the CPU running the game, as it's forced to go down the list of conditions and check through each one until it finds the correct one. So when working with multiple conditions we want to check for, it's better to use a switch statement. This is because switch statements work by comparing a variable with predefined values that we tell it to check for, and then producing a result when it finds the value that the variable is currently set to from the list. Here's how they work. First, we write the keyword switch, followed by two brackets. Inside the brackets, we write the name of the variable we want to evaluate. In our case, we want to check for the tag of the collided object our raycast has found. So we'll write rh.collider.tag. Now notice how we didn't include the equality comparator like we would in an if statement, as we're not comparing our variable to a specific value or condition just yet. Next, we create a body for the statement. Inside the body, we're going to write out each value of our variable we want to check for, followed by our desired result if the value is met. Each value and its respective result will be broken up into its own section. Now at the start of each section, we write the keyword case to say that we're starting a new section. We then follow that up with the value we want to check for and a colon. So for example, the first tag we created was the earth tag. So we're going to write that out as string data and follow it with a colon. Underneath, we then write the result of the variable being set to that value, followed by a semicolon. Now in our case, if the raycast finds an object tagged as earth, we want to set the material value variable to equal 1. Then to end the section, underneath the result, we write the keyword break followed by a semicolon. We then repeat that for each value and result we want to include. So for example, we know that if our raycast finds an object tagged with stone, we want to set material value to equal 2. Once you've done that, go ahead and repeat that for the remaining two materials. Once done, your code should look something like this. Now, optionally, when using switch statements, you can include a final default section, which you start by writing the keyword default, followed by a colon. The result that we put inside the default section will be set if the switch statement is triggered, but none of the case values are met. So inside the default section, we're going to tell our switch statement to set the material value variable to 1. Setting the parameter of our event to play earth footsteps if the raycast finds that the player's on top of an object that hasn't been tagged with one of our 4 materials. The last thing to note about switch statements is that the values that you can check for in each case must be considered constant. Now, a constant value simply means that it will not change once our game starts running. Raw data, such as string data like our tags, are considered constant as the data itself cannot be changed. However, if we were to check to see if the value of the variable in question matched with the value of another variable, we would get an error. For example, you'll remember in our lesson that we created variables for each of our tags. So if we were to replace our data with those variables, you'll see we'll get an error indicated by the small red squiggly line underneath the variable. Now this is because variables are not considered constant. They can be changed later by code whilst the game is running. What we could do, however, is scroll up to where the variables were first declared, and just before the data type, write the word const, short for constant, which now tells our script that the values of these variables cannot be changed within our class and functions. If we then scroll back down to our switch statement, we can see that the red line has now disappeared. Now in the case of our footstep script, using either else if or a switch statement would work, and whilst we don't have too many conditions to check for in this example, it's good to know how to use switch statements as an alternative to multiple else if statements to make your code cleaner and run a little more smoothly. Now if you wish to learn more about switch statements and constant values, there will be more resources for you to check out underneath this video. But once you feel you've understood everything perfectly, you can now head on over to this module's challenge task.